Welcome, everyone. My name is Miah Michaelsen, and I'm Deputy Director for the Indiana Arts Commission. And thanks so much for joining us for From the Field, Reopening Plans and Best Practices. I'd like to thank everyone who registered. We have, at last count, almost 400 folks from around the state who had registered, and many of you submitted questions, and thank you for that. For those that didn't have a chance to submit a question, as our panel of professional peer experts make their presentations, and if questions come up, please enter them in the comments in Facebook, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So without any further ado, I'm going to toss it over to Ricci, our Executive Director. Take it away, Louis.
Miah, thank you. Today we have a panel of arts administrators from around the state with expertise with organizations and programs of various types and business models. Our purpose here today is twofold. One is to explore and share best practices and planning as our sector is positioned to reopen, and two, to help inform the Office of the Governor as they build out the specifics for each phase of the state's reopening plan, Indiana Back on Track. To give us an overview of the governor's roadmap to reopening the state and how the arts community currently fits into that roadmap is Governor Holcomb's Deputy Chief of Staff, Jane Jankowski. Jane, first of all, thank you for spending time with us this morning. We know the governor's office is working tirelessly on behalf of all of us during this time. Jane, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, Louis, and thanks to everyone else for joining today. We know that this is a difficult time for everyone, and each and every day that we are working across state government with our COVID-19 team as well as stakeholders, we are trying to make the best decisions, that strike a balance both for the safety of citizens and for, our ability for the economy to work. And so that is really the purpose of the governor's Back on Track plan, which he announced on May the 1st. So we are really in the middle of stage 2 of the plan right now. And stage 2 extends right now through Saturday, May the 23rd. The way that we started to think about this is actually in a room with our doctors, and I'm sure that many of you have seen Dr. Box and Dr. Weaver and Dr. Raciniak and Dr. Sullivan and others as the governor has done his daily announcements. And we really started with 4 principles to guide our decision-making about reopening the state. The first one is to track the hospitalizations of people with COVID-19 across the state, and to be able to show a steady decline over 14 days in hospitalizations for the disease. Our second principle involves our ability to retain our surge capacity at hospitals and with other healthcare providers, and on a daily basis we provide information about critical care beds available, ventilators available, emergency department runs. These are all things that we track. And by the way, since we have gotten into month 3 in this, one of the things that I've discovered, which I didn't know before, is that we have a lot of really smart health data people who are constantly looking at data, evaluating it, and looking at models that have been developed all over the world to really give us the best information to enable Governor Holcomb to make decisions. The other things that we've taken into consideration as a part of our 4 principles are our ability to contact trace, for which we have set up a separate system that really has just gotten underway this week on a much broader scale to be able to track and contact individuals who have tested positive for the disease and be able to reach you know, those who have been in close contact with them. And then finally, our ability to increase the number of tests that we're doing daily. This is something that we work on every day, and in fact have had meetings, extensive meetings just in the last couple of days to develop even further plans to get us to additional testing throughout the state. You may have seen the results of the initial round of a scientific study that the Fairbanks School of Health is doing for the state that was announced a couple of days ago. We were able to do random tests for close to 5,000 people, and that has really provided us with some good information about, for example, approximately 45% of those who came back as positive were completely asymptomatic. So we know that we have approximately 185,000 Hoosiers who have already had this disease or currently are positive for it. And this kind of information is really going to help us be informed as we move through the stages of the Governor's Back on Track plan. We are right now in full development of putting the details around stage 3 of the plan, which we will announce at some point next week. And as we're thinking about stage 3, we're also, of course, as we move towards stage 4 and stage 5, also trying to think more in detail about the categories that will come into play as we move into those stages down the line. So for me, this conversation today is very informative because the lines of business and organizations that you represent are those that we will be talking about and trying to plan for very much more closely in the coming weeks. So with that, I'll stop, Louis.
Thank you, Jane, so much for being here and for listening to this group. And I'm pleased to introduce our panel today from around the state. Ernest Disney-Britton, Vice President of Community Impact and Investment at the Arts Council of Indianapolis. Aili McGill, Executive Director of Nickel Plate Arts in Noblesville. And McKim, Executive Director of the Arts Council of Southwestern Indiana in Evansville. 𝙁𝙤𝙘𝙀𝙀, President and CEO of the Honeywell Foundation in Wabash. Don Steffi, Executive Director of the Indianapolis Children's Choir. And Charles Venable, the Melvin and Brent Simon Director and CEO of Newfields. Charles, I'd like to start with you. Newfields is an institution with a rather complex business model as you encompass not only a major art museum, but a 152-acre cultural campus, including gardens, performance and education venues, multiple places for meetings and gatherings, food service, retail space, and many other attributes. I know you have developed a detailed business reopening plan. Tell me about that plan. Specifically, how does it respond to the framework of local and state government directives? Who had input into the elements of the plan? And what sources of wisdom did it reference? And also tell me about the staged approach to your reopening rather than simply a hard reopening. So if you could respond to those, but then any other things that you think are important for people to know about developing a plan. Charles.
Well, thank you, Louis. It's a great pleasure to be here today with our colleagues from across the state. So yes, actually, Newfields is a very complicated place with a big variety of everything from, we have 3 theaters, including outdoor, indoor ones, cafes, as you mentioned, gardens, parks, et cetera, et cetera. In the normal time, that variety is what makes us so special and wonderful. And this time, it makes it really complicated to figure out how to reopen to the public and how to keep the public safe, and also our 300 plus staff members who operate Newfields. We are very fortunate in that we have an emergency preparedness task force, and we've had that before the crisis certainly ever hit. It is led by our Chief Operating Officer, 𝘾𝙤𝙢𝙢𝙢, who's really very gifted in organizing things like these types of processes. And then also we have a staff member named Ann Young, who is our Director of Intellectual Property and Legal Affairs. And they have worked across across all of the teams at Newfields to build out a 17-page checklist, basically, about how to, first it started on how to close a complicated organization, and now it's sort of reversed engineered to be how to reopen one. And as I told you, Louis, we'll be happy to share that with the notes so anybody can see if there's things that would pertain to your organizations. That plan, because there's so much uncertainty in the world, it actually covers 3 different scenarios that we could imagine. One would be the most hopeful, which is not where we are at the moment, which is, you know, we can open, magic happens, we can reopen fairly easily with no limitations whatsoever. Then we have that scenario with limitations on group size and capacity. And then the one that you mentioned that we're going for is really reopening in phases. And we have phase 1, we'll be reopening our garden and park, which are obviously outdoor spaces. We can get entrance for the public more easily to those. And then we will reopen our very large Indianapolis Museum of Art a month later, we're hoping, if all goes well, in July. And so we have worked diligently to try to keep abreast of, frankly, a wave of information that one's been trying to keep up with. So the main tenets for our process is we've really been looking at OSHA, the Center for Disease Control guidelines, the World Health Organization, and we found some very large sister sort of networks of institutions like the Smithsonian, which is huge, but they also have resident medical personnel and things like that within their staff. So that's been very useful. And these links are in the plan that we'll be willing to share. The National Park Service, because if you're an outdoor venue, they also have some same issues we do, and a lot of resources that they've put towards that. Calls like this, if you haven't been joining those regularly, they're very, very useful to us. So we thank you for your leadership on that. But in the end, the triggers that actually make us change our plan, makes us become more flexible, et cetera, are really coming from the governor's office. We're following those orders really seriously. And then if those orders get, you know, if we have to extend time, we just roll our plan out so many weeks and continue working on it. And then locally, here in Indianapolis, our mayor also has orders, and we overlay those on top. As I mentioned, we're trying to get the gardens and the park open by mid-June, and then follow that a month later. And that's very intentional, because obviously doing things indoors is so much more complicated than outdoors. But also we wanted to give ourselves 4 weeks of real life experience with the public, because it's very hard to predict how the public's going to behave. You know, do they take this exceedingly serious? And we know there's a big spectrum of people who will do that. We'll have people show up with masks. We'll have other people who won't show up with masks. And so we're trying to particularly reach out to colleagues around the country where their states have already allowed them to reopen, and learning in real time how are they dealing with their public, and what is their public saying through their actions and through their words. We have the ability to be able to invite the public back with very strict time ticketing, which will help us manage. So we'll know exactly how many people are coming through our doors and our garden gates at any given moment, so that we can obey limits on crowd size. And those tickets will be all online. You will not be able to get one on site. There will be no cash transactions whatsoever. Members will get in free, but they will have to have a reservation, and they will have to print and bring their tickets that we can scan. And all those tickets will be issued in 30-minute blocks, because even in a 50-acre garden, we believe 100 people per 30 minutes with an average stay of about an hour and 30 minutes can keep us within that 250 limit, spread out across actually quite a lot of acreage. And then depending on what we learn there, we believe we'll apply the same rubric to letting people in the building. The building is very complicated. It's over 600,000 square feet, and we have sizes from, you know, single stall bathrooms all the way up to 10,000 square feet exhibition spaces. But we are working on plans to try to figure out how many people can be in every one of those spaces. The big thing we're all going to grapple with is, how do you police that? and how do you make sure people are sort of clumping together through that. And so, you know, it is difficult, even with a big staff and, you know, a lot of talented people working on this and keeping up, trying to figure out capacity for an institution that has 152 acres of property, gardens and parks, and then our building is 660,000 square feet with all kinds of spaces, as I just said. So some of the things that we're still trying to figure out, and you know, on this call, maybe other people can add to that, is you know, is the cap cumulative in terms of if we have so many people in a cafe where we're abiding by restaurant rules under the order, but we have 200 people out in a garden, our overall capacity for Newfields, what actually is that? And it sounds maybe a little bit in the weeds, but you know, are we counting our staff towards our capacity caps? We assume we are, because it's really about people, not about guests versus your staff. And what does that do to our ability to operate? We have many sizes of public bathrooms, but none of them are like 10,000 square feet where we can disperse people out very well. So how does your capacity get limited by your planning for people going in and out of bathrooms when we all are going to be incredibly constrained in terms of that, if we can only have like one person in a bathroom at a time until they come out before the next person can go in. So that is a general overview, and I'll be happy to answer specific questions, and we will be sending out our overall plan.
Thank you so much, Charles. I'm going to turn now to Todd Minnick, and to a primarily performing arts situation, although also Todd has a fairly large campus with food service and gallery space and other things as well. But the Honeywell Center is a large performing house with about 1,500 seats. And Todd also operates the Eagles Theater, a smaller venue with 440 seats. Todd, what does your reopening plan encompass, and how are your considerations for a larger venue versus a smaller venue compare?
Yeah, thanks, Louis. Well, we have all the same concerns that Charles outlined and are trying to work through those answers. In terms of our two venues, the Eagles Theater is the smaller venue, and actually with the renovation now is capped at about 560 seats, traditional small rows and a lot of aisleways. The Ford Theater is a 1,500 seat theater and has no center aisle. So addressing questions of how do you get people into rows without having to walk by other people in those rows creates a bottleneck for capacity. At this point, we have not tried to look at Ford Theater capacity scalings. We just don't feel like we have enough information to understand how we might be able to do that. And out of this call and additional information coming, we hope that we'll get some additional clarity and direction on how to seat that theater. In the Eagles Theater, our capacity, the social distance, the theater itself, and the seating is about 20% of the overall capacity to keep everybody spaced in the seats themselves, which still doesn't address the questions of getting people to restrooms, funneled in and out of doors. So there are a lot of questions about how to get that done responsibly and safely for our guests. We're certainly working on rope and stanchions and signage and spike mark X's 6 feet apart in predetermined lines. But there still are choke points with a number of doors getting in and out of buildings, which is not unique to theaters. It's really a challenge everybody faces. In a theater, it's a little harder to get one-way traffic, and in certain restrooms, it's harder to get one-way traffic.
Todd, what advice might you give to larger presenters throughout the state and smaller presenters from what you've considered and what you're learning, not only on site, but also from peers around the state and around the country? I know that you also are plugged into those types of resources, so.
Sure, thanks. So we have a number of different team members heading different areas of this reopening. So we have people attending webinars, as I'm sure everybody's organization does. And those have been very helpful. We're trying to filter through now what's helpful and perhaps what's turning into more of future sales calls. There's a little bit of information overload, but we've attended various payroll protections, been a big event, a lot of questions around what that's going to look like in final reporting. From a safety standpoint, back on track, @indiana.gov has been very helpful. Again, we hope for additional direction in how we might continue to reopen in future phases. Association of Arts Presenters, the Indiana Presenters Network is going to meet on Monday. We've reviewed materials from the National Safety Council. In our region, Parkview Health has been very helpful with seminars on reopening and how to safely do that. And then IAC events like this. For us, we're really trying to implement best practices, and we're trying to communicate as much as we can, communicate with our staff, communicate with the public. We are doing a preview event to try out all of our new procedures at the drive-in movie theater we operate. So there'll be a preview event tomorrow night, and then we formally reopen the following weekend. For us, as with I'm sure everybody, this is not just about reopening, it's really about completely relaunching the business in a new way with a lot of variables that we still don't really know the answer to. We don't know how the audience is going to behave, as was mentioned. We don't know how much audience really will come back. A lot of our audience for certain activities we do is in that high risk age category, and we've certainly heard from them that they won't be back until there's a vaccine. We don't know what percentage of the audience that represents. So as we reopen, there are just a lot of unknowns. I think everybody's facing those unknowns, but through this, we've really tried to make sure we're communicating with all of our constituents.
Thank you, Todd. I'm gonna turn to Aili now. So another complex art situation is the cultural district concept, which encompasses nonprofit artists institutions, for-profit stores, restaurants, etc., and engages in both large and small festivals, performances, arts demonstrations, and other public activities in non-traditional spaces. Many of these opportunities revolve around bringing people together informally, usually in minimally controlled situations. Aili, you direct one of our state's cultural districts in Noblesville and are a consultant to another in Fishers. How does a public festival look different to respond to imperatives such as social distancing and crowd density?
Yeah, thanks, Louis. This is something we're working hard on figuring out right now. I think one of the key things we all have to embrace moving forward is that capacity for festivals is probably smaller moving forward and more selective with a lot of communication in advance and out at the event about expectations and how things are going to work. We definitely, from other places we're looking at around the state, one thing we want to highly encourage is very close collaboration with your city and county health and safety departments to make sure that you are really aware of what the particular expectations and situation is for your area. Although we've all been in isolation for the past 8 weeks or so, we should not be planning in isolation by any means. This is when collaboration is more important than ever, so that we can keep all of those plans in good coordination and look at taking care of everyone as effectively as possible. I think it's really important for us to know our space considerations. Both gentlemen who have spoken already have talked about really thinking about how many people safely fit in their indoor spaces, and that is really true for outdoor spaces as well. And that can help you create a traffic flow plan. You need to identify those pinch points in advance of where are some of those funnel points, like whether it's restrooms or other spaces where people are going to have to get in closer proximity. And I think we're going to have to really think about how we handle entrances and exits, again, so that you don't have too small a funnel for folks where they have to get really close together, but where you can still have some sense of being able to count attendance and also communicate expectations as people come and go. I think what we've heard already about thinking through cash transactions is something really important for festivals as well. How can you minimize the amount of physical contact with things that make it easy to transmit COVID or any other disease? That's something we really need to think about now. And we may also need to start thinking about new expenses that may be a part of festivals that have not been true in the past, such as personal protective equipment, hand sanitizing stations, hand washing stations throughout festival grounds. And then we also really probably need to start thinking about virtual elements as well. I think for a long time, maybe forever, we may really start adding seeing interest in having virtual experiences for those folks who either really need to stay in isolation, or maybe even those who just can't physically attend your event. It's an interesting opportunity, but it's also a challenge we need to think through. I think people need to be prepared to have safety officers visible at events and very present, and in friendly but firm ways reinforcing practices of social distancing. And I think that's a strategy people need to talk through in advance, how you're going to talk about and approach people as you may observe situations that aren't as safe for everyone who's participating at the festival. And this is a time when we need to probably really think about how we want to address removing people who are not observing the rules. Is that something your community is comfortable with? How do you want to tackle that situation if the need arises? The other couple of things, and I know other folks are going to talk about this throughout the presentation as well, food vendors are going to have very different expectations than they have in the past. I know right now the encouragement is definitely to not have people serve themselves and to limit as many as possible, or to limit those situations where they may be sharing like a ketchup dispenser or things like that. That's a situation that is not really safe currently, and can really change the dynamic of public festivals and how we handle food at those. So I highly encourage people to really work with their health departments on what those expectations are. And similarly, musical performances are things we need to think about as well, because especially when you're singing and breathing deeply, that's a situation that can spread the disease more easily as well. And so thinking about distance with performers, and even just how people may be passively gathering around those performers, those are all really important aspects of planning festivals at this point.
You've sort of touched on it a little, Aili, but talk a little bit more about, you've talked about interactions with patrons, but talk a little bit more about artists with patrons and then artists with artists in a typical festival, either from a performing arts standpoint or a visual arts exhibition standpoint.
Yeah, and I think, so this is another situation where we need to think about spreading out that space more. So if you have if you're planning a festival with vendors, I think we all need to think about having more space between those vendor booths, and also probably providing guidance for vendors in advance of what good procedures are, both encouraging them to use personal protective equipment and maybe even helping them mark out spaces in their booth to show, we've all seen that at grocery stores, right? Where there's the X on the ground at the checkout station. That may be something we need to look at these festivals as well. How do we sort of give people visual guidelines that help protect that space? Probably we need to think about scheduling and spacing out like a performance stage or something where one group would be coming in after another. I think we're going to have to be providing a lot of extra time and a lot of extra attention to cleaning and sanitizing any spaces that are being shared in that way, especially if you think about microphones and other handheld things that, I think it's unlikely that most of our communities are going to be able to provide a different microphone for every single performer or announcer who does something at an event. And so coming up with a strategy in advance to keep those things safe and to keep people spaced out from each other, I think is really important.
Finally, Aili, any thoughts about, festivals and community type events like this are these shared community experiences, and that's what is at the heart of them. How do you keep that intact when you're separating people actively because of the health concerns? How do you keep the community experience intact in some way?
Yeah. Well, before I forget too, I wanted to add one more thing, which is a couple of folks have already talked about sort of practicing this in advance. And I think one opportunity is to reach out to your audience and almost do a by invitation only practice event where you have a very limited audience. It gives you the chance to sort of test. That's what we're going to do with the First Friday in Noblesville. Reach out to our members first, have them come in and test those practices. And then of course they are part of helping you solve this problem. So that's one way to help build that sense of community. But I think, excuse me, our virtual life is another way that we can help transcend the social distancing period. So working in advance, during, and after the event to have some social media hashtags or themes that help tell the story over the course of the event and tie people together, really encouraging people to share their photos and stories on a virtual platform to keep that going. I also think the arts are give us a grand opportunity to do temporary public art that helps celebrate and make things visually appealing and exciting to help transcend the weirdness of new and sometimes kind of even almost oppressive feeling procedures. So thinking about integrating your local artists into the process of decorating or even decorating windows in the downtown area so that the space is especially exciting and special as people go through.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to turn now to Don Steffi. Don, I'd like to explore the core of many of the issues being dealt with as they primarily relate to protecting people while ensuring the integrity and viability of an art experience. I want to talk for a moment about artist issues, especially in the performing arts. Don, you are the ED of the Indianapolis Children's Choir, a large ensemble that typically performs shoulder to shoulder, and you also spend much of your life as a professional dancer. When thinking about a path forward for your young performers and their art form, as well as your own experience as an ensemble performer, how will the art form need to be adjusted to navigate the realities of social distancing?
Fabulous. Thank you and welcome everybody. In the interest of time, I've kind of written out a few key points because what you just asked could be a whole hour down the road. But here's the essence, and I want to start with this, with the artist itself. First of all, I think with everybody online, it is so wonderful to see, and I think we need to make sure we're expressing that, how responsible this arts community is, and as leaders in a community to let people know we are leading how to deal with COVID. We're not reacting to it. And just by what everybody has said today, that's an example of how arts do lead. The artists themselves, first of all, they always embrace a challenge. So I'm not all that concerned about the art in some ways, because here's what I wrote. I mean, at the Indianapolis Children's Choir, our artistic staff, led by Joshua Petty, I'm telling you, they have done remarkable work already since early March, and I'll get to that. But I want to back in your comment about dance just briefly and even theater. So what I am thinking, and I know it's happening, is that artists will already start, and I'm sure playwrights are already writing plays that reflect the social situation that we're in right now. So that is one of the things that's going to be happening. Choreographers, yes, they may try to adapt a little, some existing choreography. What's going to happen is choreographers are going to think of new ways to use social distancing in new works to amplify this particular social situation. And that's going to be exciting. So then they don't have to think, well, how do I do this? You know, some of the classical works are going to be a little difficult, but you know what? Some are going to say, no, they're not. We're not going to try to tolerate social distancing. We're going to embrace it in the way we create. And that's just the comments I want to make briefly on that. In terms of the choral world, that is a tough one. Both Josh and myself have been on many calls around the choral world because indeed, as you said, how close at some point you really have to be, or you will lose the sound. But as Aili pointed out, both orchestras and the choral world, you can also spread in a heartbeat by verbosely singing, and it's already documented that easily 6, 10, and even 16 feet, you could be spreading out droplets. Well, by the time you spread, in our situation, hundreds of children, not just 30 children, hundreds, there isn't a venue that could hold us. So what you have to do, and this is what the children's choir did, and our good friend Google, as I was researching, phenomenal what's happening already in the arts world all over. But you know, we are also a music ed organization. And immediately the artistic staff jumped in because they had to make sure they're engaging these young artists to keep them connected rather than being so isolated at their homes, because they don't have school now. They're online learning. So they started right away with classes, teaching, and weekly rehearsals. So they were developing already the use of technology, and that's where I'm going with this. So much so that once they got friendly with that in terms of teaching, then that didn't stop them. So how do we create a choral experience for the public? And a few weeks ago, they put together their very first choral song. And ironically, it's called Unity. So it's the unity of the choir, but it's also the unity of technology and the choral world. And that is going to be, I invite everybody on June 11th, because we've canceled many concerts. We unfortunately had to cancel our concert closer, which would have incorporated May concerts into one gigantic concert, but we're going to do it virtually. And they are going to find a way that all of these individual choirs will perform in a grand finale online. And that is, I think, what's happening in terms of the art of people, is that they're going to find a way. You know, artists love a challenge, as I said earlier. So it's not pulling back from it, it's going forward with it. And I also see that it's going to take a long time for the choral world to come out of this. Just from what we said, even the orchestra world, there are some orchestras, they're adapting their programming, because you got the strings, which then you can stay large, but all these other instrumentalists who are blowing out everything to the world, well, they can pull that back with a chamber, they can go duets, but the choral experience is a large group experience. But what I see happening is, we at ICC may very well look at a whole day of mini concerts, because we want to give the opportunity for these performers to perform, where you might have a small group on stage 15 feet apart, but all of a sudden you will have video screens of all the rest of the singers, and you'll have this huge choral experience going on. And then you'll change out, you'll give the other children a chance to actually be on stage. The other ones will go back, whether it's at their home, or we're going to have to partner potentially with schools, to where these kids can be in all these classrooms somewhere. And all the gentlemen with and Aili with the venues, we usually love the fact that we are a carousel season, meaning we perform in all these different venues. So in terms of our business plan to reopen, we have to connect all of these churches and performing venues to find out, what are they doing? What's going to be available to us? Because at the heart of the matter for a children's organization, and it's one of our board adopted values, safety is prime when you're dealing with children and families. So those venues have to be able to offer to us the assurance that if we come in, there is safety. And I'll stop there for that at the moment.
Thank you.
Next
Thank
question.
you, Don. I'm going to turn now to McKim. Ann, let's talk for a moment about any perceived or real differences as the arts reopen in a rural versus a more urban situation. And you're the Arts Commission's regional partner in a largely rural part of the state, Southwestern Indiana. Do you think that smaller arts providers, galleries, small performance venues, artist studios have a unique set of considerations for reopening, and what are they?
Absolutely, and thank you for including the rural areas in this conversation. Lewis knows just how rural we are because I got him lost in a cornfield while touring District 10 several months ago. So the thing that I see the most is that smaller and rural arts organizations don't have the same staffing capacity as, say, Charles at Newfields, where you've got a team working on the research, developing the plans. And what I'm seeing is consistently people are following guidelines issued by the IAC and guidelines issued by Governor Holcomb's office. That is the #1 response that I saw when I sent out some questions to grantees and other arts organizations preparing for this conversation. So what that means is that they're really saying, okay, if the governor's office is saying that we can open on June 14th, that's when we want to try to open. We don't have a ton of extra information coming in. But again, consistently over and over and over with these small and particularly volunteer-run organizations, the main priority is safety. So they're not looking at staff salaries. They're not looking necessarily at leases or mortgages. They're saying, can we safely provide these experiences? If we can't, it's not worth it to open. It's not worth it to have the season. So what that means in rural areas is that there are no arts experiences that are going to be available if people choose not to open. There's not just a plethora of options or opportunities. A lot of these experiences are seasonal, and they're events based. And so if you don't have if you don't feel safe in your ability to provide this experience, you're going to cancel the event. And then we're looking at a community that really is not going to have arts, culture, community experience for perhaps another year until we come back around to the next arts season. I think that really is sort of the heart of the question for many of us down here. Are we opening because we want to make sure that our creative community, our creative sector remains employed and contributing to the economy? Or are we trying to reopen to make sure that we are getting art every day into everyone's lives everywhere in the state, because that fundamentally is essential to have a state that can support quality of life and arts experiences for everyone. Another thing that I'm seeing with smaller galleries, some of the, there are options for PPE, there are options for safety measures to be implemented, but there aren't really the resources to purchase additional equipment or supplies or materials to enhance or ensure safety. So a lack of resources in these already sort of underfunded organizations is only amplified by now saying, okay, well, we need not just our normal resources, we need clear glass partitions or plexiglass partitions to keep people safe. Smaller, oh, yes, sir?
No, go ahead. I thought you were at a pause.
Oh, well, I was just taking a breath. I have a lot to say. Smaller venues. So I loved it when I think Todd said his small venue was 560 seats. I'm looking at Veal Creek Players in Washington, Indiana, who have a 76-seat theater. So if they're going down to social distancing, that's 24 guests who can attend at any given time, which then makes it essentially cost prohibitive because you can't charge $100 a ticket to make up for the tickets that are unsold. So again, there's a lot of questions in the air still, a lot of trying to figure it out. And I will say, I don't want it to come across that that in the rural areas, folks don't know what they're doing. I think that everybody is being so incredibly intentional and thoughtful and working really hard. But again, paramount is that health and safety. So if we lose arts experiences now, the big question is, what can we as a community, what can we as a state do to ensure that when we're on the other side of this in 12 months, 18 months, that we can really make sure that we have that incredibly strong, vital arts community ready to go again if we have to take a little break. So.
And I wonder if you'd also talk a little bit about self-employed artists. So about adjusting their own business models or operations to respond to this, people with studios, people who might have small galleries that they own, those type of things. So self-employed artists, what are you seeing and hearing?
So one, I do want to make sure that everyone's aware of the artist survey that the Indianapolis Arts Commission or Arts Council and the IAC and other partners, the Humanities Council around the state have put out. I think that we'll get some really good information coming back through those results. What I'm seeing, I see a lot of issues with mortgages. I know of at least 2 artists who've had to, who lost their studio space because of being unable to pay their mortgage during the last few months. And that's the result of, a lot of these folks are teaching artists as well. So you have art classes, gallery, all of the pieces have to work together in order to for the whole to function. And so if you lose a piece, if you lose the opportunity to generate income through arts classes, then the whole thing sort of falls. What I see, and a particular concern at the Arts Council is our musicians. Those folks book out, their gigs several months in advance. They have a very clear idea of how much money they're going to be making, and they really rely on that as part of their income. It's much more predictable than for a visual artist sometimes selling a painting, selling a piece, or earning a commission. But if you are saying, okay, I've got these gigs through September and then they're all canceled, how can we as the Arts Council work to ensure that our musicians are still able to make, to earn income during this time in a safe way? I think something that's a little bit harder to articulate, but is incredibly important in the arts community, is that art is not really created in a vacuum. And so it's not networking, that's not really what I'm referring to, but it's inspiration and connectivity and education to a certain extent that occurs when artists are able to interact with each other or see each other's work in a gallery setting. And that's because, we have great universities that train up really incredible artists, but we also have a lot of local artists who are self-taught or who learn that way or who look at it as continuing education. So when we're losing the opportunity for artists to interact and share and inspire one another, we're creating a vacuum in that space as well, and one that we're trying to figure out, how do we address that as we reopen? The Arts Council, something that we've done is try to move a lot of our programming virtually to like online content. And we've been able to showcase artist studios and do artist demo videos and things like that, so that we're still able to connect these creative folks with each other just via a virtual platform. I'm going to say one more thing before you have any more questions for me, or before I give up the floor to anyone else. I think when we talk about rural areas, if there are ever silver linings, seeing arts organizations, Don's talking about June 11th, putting their experiences, putting their content out digitally, that's a way that we're getting the children's choir into these deeply rural areas where that's not an opportunity or hasn't been an option in the past. And I think that if we're really committed to serving the entire state, that's a place that we as arts administrators need to make sure that we continue moving into the future, whether or not we're able to gather again in 6 months or 12 months. We want to get that art into Spencer County and Perry County and Pike County. So
Thank you, Anne. I'm going to turn now to Ernest Disney-Britton from the Arts Council of Indianapolis. Turning back to the impact on the situation, specifically on people and how to adjust business practices, the arts community has a disproportionately large segment of people in higher risk categories. This includes both artists and patrons who are older adults and people who have underlying medical conditions. The arts also serve communities which have been significantly impacted by the public health crisis, including people of color. Ernest, what are you hearing from communities of color regarding engagement with the arts and their concerns during a reopening of our cultural community? And also, how do the demographics of the main human components of an arts opportunity, artists and audiences, adjust thinking beyond what one might consider for the general public?
Thank you, Louis, and it's a real honor and opportunity for the Arts Council of Indianapolis to be a part of this statewide discussion. The Arts Council of Indianapolis is committed to ensuring a creative life for all. The term all, of course, includes all of our most vulnerable populations. That includes older audience members and artists who are, as we all know and you've mentioned, are part of that high-risk group. But it also involves young people. So about a week ago, just a week ago, we started to convene our recovery task force with 9 subgroups, cohorts, if you may, collectively working together to adopt recovery practices based on 3 priorities: health and safety, number 2 is mission, and 3 is equity, to ensure equity for all of those who are hardest hit. That includes older artists and audience members, but it also includes youth. We know that in the city of Indianapolis and across the country, the COVID-19 has ravaged the Black communities nationally and locally. In the state of Indiana, despite making up 9.8% of the population, we make up about 18.5% of all positive cases and 19.2% of the state's 300 deaths. At the same time, we've been assessing the financial health of our local arts partners. While the impact is devastating for all, whether a $20,000 all volunteer-led organization or a $40 million museum, the most vulnerable organizations are those being led and focused on serving people of color, and also those that are serving youth. We made our assessments based on 5 key factors, and I can go into those at another time or provide those in detail. But based on our assessment, 75% of youth education organizations and 71% of the people of color focused organizations are at the highest risk for not surviving this crisis. We are looking, what I'm hearing is that organizations are looking to find out how will the state really help us through this hibernation phase? How will the state provide additional resources and guidance from the Department of Education for those who are working with schools and are dependent on those relationships? Will there be additional insights and guidance and support from the Office of Minority and Business and Women Business Development? Also, we want to avoid, and I hear this repeatedly from organizations that are youth serving and led by people of color, is we do not want to see a repeat of the sort of the federal situation of PPP loans, where those with the most resources get the highest priority in terms of PPE resources that are so vital to the operations of these organizations who currently don't have specific guidance nor the resources to support these additional costs in terms of mitigation. So there are a number of questions that are coming forth. all of these groups are meeting together. We have about 9 different cohorts. We have all these priorities, and we expect to have a better sense of what's going to happen with summer camps, what's going to happen with classes in the schools, what's going to happen in terms of actors on the stage. Our organizations are of all different sizes. On a call just recently with the theater cohort in terms of recovery. We have our largest organizations with proscenium stage. We have our smallest organizations with the basement stage, or an outdoor stage, or a black box. And we're trying to figure out how to work around all of those issues while adhering to the same CDC and state guidelines that all of the groups are wrestling with, but also dealing with the fact that these are organizations that have been under-resourced in the past, and how are we during this recovery going to ensure their success and evolution for the end of this line, and to continue servicing those at-risk populations during this time of shutdown. There's lots of discussion about how we can, organizations are able to engage with the virtual environment, but there's also this really key factor that the actual process of gathering and people being together is an essential part, in the same way it is with sports. It's the essential part of how the arts become a part of you, and how the arts become a core part of your family life, your church life. There's a lot of overlap between the Black church environment and the Black performing arts audience and experiences. It is very clear when you look at any of the Black church websites or go to their programs that you see many of the same musicians from the Black community who were actually performing at the Jazz Kitchen, or also at Presbyterian Church here in town. And so we're seeing all of that overlap, and we want to certainly learn from others, but we also want to make sure that the importance of equity, which was an incredible priority for the community moving into COVID, and we were making some real progress, but there is also a growing concern about the disparities that we're seeing in terms of health during the crisis, and what will this look like afterwards.
Thank you.
I have a lot more I could say, but.
Thank you, Ernest, very much. We are, of course, approaching 11 o'clock, which is what we wanted to make this an hour-long conversation here today. I know many of you have submitted questions or comments, and we're going to do our best, I think, to summarize those and try to even engage our experts here at giving us some answers to that we can perhaps post online for you folks. We'll summarize, synthesize some of those questions. There was one other area that I just wanted to touch on briefly and to throw this out to everyone, and that is, again, as we look, whether it's a very large, sophisticated organization or a very small rural or urban organization, a lot of the people power and a lot of the people that are involved and are part of both the solution and the risk, I suppose, of reopening are volunteers. So, and this interprets into ushers and docents and parents and many other aspects of volunteerism. When we look at our 600 grantees in the state, that interprets into thousands upon thousands of volunteers who make festivals and other things run. Someone talk a little bit about how you are thinking about involving and protecting volunteers. Who wants to try that?
Louis, I can take a pass at it. For us, we're going to treat them the way we always have, as we treat our employees, as unpaid employees of the organization. So they will have all the same safety equipment. They'll have the same procedures and training. Back to that communication, there's a lot of extra communication and extra training that will be required. And for our organization, a lot of our volunteers are in that high risk category. So we anticipate a number of them won't come back, which raises a question of if we can open back up a capacity, how do we open up? So it creates a staffing challenge. But the short answer is we'll provide them the same support and education and training that we provide all of our existing staff with all the new policies and training programs that we put in place.
Louis, we're doing exactly the same thing. However, we're counting on a very serious labor shortage. We know many of those volunteers that we all rely on. We have hundreds of volunteers that make everything from winter lights down to our smallest program operate. And many of those people are in our at-risk categories. And we already know some of them, like docents and people, we're already surveying them, and many of them are saying, I will come back when there's a vaccine, would be the most, sort of extreme answer, but totally understandable, down to I'll come back later, but there's no answer to what later is going to be. So in order to make sure we can focus on our most important, particularly now revenue generating things, because we desperately are going to need that revenue to come in. We are frankly cutting an enormous amount of our activity and our events out of our schedule. And it's not just for June. We've already canceled all our summer camps. We're going to be canceling hundreds of things that we normally do for relatively small audiences, including, children education, all those kind of things, so that we can focus on the things that are absolutely essential, we believe, for our survival as a major organization going forward. I'm now saying, we have to focus on what is essential, not on the things that are nice to have. And I don't mean to be, overly black and white about that or cruel, but we're not going to be able to have the resources from labor to money to be able to do what we've done for decades and decades and decades. There's just not, unless there's more support coming from government somewhere to say that they'll help us with operating. There's just not going to be possible.
Louis, I just want to add that in terms of the groups within Indianapolis, particularly the African-American groups that have this incredible crossover in terms of the Black church, there are a number of conversations that indicate that, they are just telling their volunteers to stay at home until they receive some sort of guidance and assurity that it is safe to go out. There are 9 of the largest Black denominations across the country have urged their congregations to stay at home. There's lots of crossover between the supporters and patrons of Black performing arts organizations and also churches. And until there is some certainty that the health care of those older patrons can be accommodated within arts organizations and in churches, they're not coming back, as Charles has already mentioned. We need some more guidance on that. We need some assurances as part of that process. And there's even questions about if churches are open, and how is the state planning on making sure that the rest of the performing arts community is sort of learning and being informed by that process.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being part of this today. We're already running over a bit, and again, we will take those comments, questions, things that you've given to us in chat or before as you registered, and we'll try to synthesize some of those and have some maybe pose those to our panel too, to just get some short written responses to some of those things that you wanted some wisdom on as well. Thank you, Ernest, Aili, Ann, Todd, Don, and Charles for your time this morning. Thank you, Jane, for coming and representing the governor's office. Be well, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon. Take care.